the worst case scenario is when you put the money down and you get a box of rocks in the container, when there's an actual scam. And so I've had the chance, working with other associates at through Global Sources, they've working with the supplier blacklist data, and we can and I was able to get access to over 3,000 complaints by buyers of suppliers across a range of countries, not just China, India, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, a lot of countries. And I wanted to understand, by looking at this data, is there a statistical relationship between steps that buyers can take and actually reduction in the severity of being scammed? So, at the high end of the severity is they take your money and nothing is shipped. A little bit lower is they take your money and you get a box of rocks. But at the low end is you just get poor quality, you get a delayed delivery, you get something. There's always something that buyers will complain about on this supplier blacklist data, but not all of these complaints are really the end of the world complaints where you lost your money. It's just that, where's my product? It's 2 weeks late. I've missed my Christmas delivery. Like, that's not, we don't see that as a severe scam here. Things happen that are outside the supplier's control, but we want to separate that from the real scams, that strategic scams that suppliers are just out there to take your money and not send you anything. And when we put that into the data, we find there are 4 factors that reduce the severity of the scam. And I'd like to share that with the audience.
That would be great. Yes.
So the first one, and that's a no-brainer, is that if the buyer verifies the business, that is highly significant with the reduction of the severity of the scam. The second one is, does the buyer have a contract with the supplier? That is very significantly related. Now, we understand that, yes, you should have a contract, but the contract won't save you. You don't necessarily have a contract so you can go to court with the supplier. In some ways, when you're working in another institutional jurisdiction, like the buyer might be in the US, the supplier might be in China, and if the buyer's an SME or small, they don't always have the resources and wherewithal to actually enforce a contract. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a contract, because having a contract helps to just set out just the expectations of each party. And so, we recommend that everyone have some sort of contract, no matter which institutional legal framework you're working with. So having a contract reduces the severity of the scam. Next is visiting the factory. Oh, surprise, surprise. Well, visiting the factory, if the buyer did visit the factory, then that's significantly associated with the reduction in the severity of the scam. And the final one was if the buyer had FOB Incoterms, which is, Renaud, you'll find this interesting, because the other, that's compared with B-port, that is, the suppliers, often they'll say to buyers, oh, don't worry about getting a forwarding agent or shipping from Shanghai or Shenzhen. We'll send it to your port in Los Angeles. We'll do everything for you. And that's the last thing that you want to get done as a buyer, because if you do that, then my data is saying that it's more likely to be associated with a scam, the severity of the scam. So there's 4 things there for our audience to take away. Number one, have verify the business. So you can get a lawyer for a very little price to actually run checks on the business in China or another country, and for a very cheap price compared to lawyers back in US or the Europe. Number 2, having a contract. Number 3, visiting the factories. And you can't do that with border closures, but the next best thing is having a third-party QC visit the factory. And finally, focusing on just stick to FOB Incoterms, Renaud.
Yes. Now, the last one is interesting. Some of these are really, and the contract also, and it's as much the buyer as the supplier. wherever you see an inexperienced buyer, who has no clue how to get the products shipped, that's where they tend to say, okay, you take care of it, you ship it CIF or DDP or whatever, right? This is really a telltale sign actually of an inexperienced buyer. And inexperienced buyers tend not to feel that there is a risk, and they tend to work with scammers a bit more, and they tend to attract scammers definitely much more, right? Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. The contract, yes, that makes sense, and it's a little bit the same story. I mean, if the buyer doesn't have a process to follow, is sort of doing everything like they would be buying domestically, they are running a lot of risks. And also, as you mentioned, it's a great prevention tool, even if you don't want to sue them. And then, yeah, basic steps like verifying that this is actually a real company and getting a little bit of information, going on globalsources.com and wherever they have a profile and things like that. I mean, that's very basic. And then visiting the factory or sending someone to visit them, right? These are very basic steps. If you skip these two steps, then you could be working with a couple of guys in an apartment, and sometimes they might not be scammers, but it might become very tempting to them because you're totally open to anything they say, and they take you for a ride. Sometimes it's the buyer really creating the opportunity more than.
I'll give you a real life example, Renaud. I'll give you a real life example because I was teaching global supply chain management this semester, and one of the assessments is that the students have to contact a supplier, get an RFQ from a supplier, and do a freight forwarding quotation. And that was the assignment, right? And more than half of the students came back to me and said, oh, don't worry, the supplier did the freight forwarding quotation for us. And that's the exact thing that we need to tell buyers to don't fall for that. Always organize independently your own freight forwarding. It sounds great that the supplier will do that for you, but the less that the supplier has a role in the logistics from your port, from the port of the country you're sourcing from to your port, the better. Yeah.
Usually, yeah, as a general rule, I would say that, yes, because it's connected to payments. If you buy FOB, which is what most buyers do, well, why do they do that? Why do they pick that Incoterm? Is because they're in control of the sea shipment. They know exactly when it's been shipped. There's no games, like their freight forwarder works for them. They get the bill of lading and so on from the supplier and so on, but on their side, they know it's been shipped and they know when it arrives. They know they can organize all the stuff on the import side, and they have their freight forwarder, broker, and so on managing it. This is why so many companies do it. Now, I know some lawyers will say, well, FOB actually includes some risks that are not covered. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's true. Okay, it's not perfect, but that's what most buyers do after they have a little bit of experience. And usually, if you let the supplier ship out, then you're actually exposed to some other mini scams, I would say, where the ship CIF, which means the supplier pays for freight all the way to the importing port, okay, and insurance. And what happens is that there's a lot of freight forwarders in China that are very happy to arrange it. And instead of charging, for example, okay, let's say they should charge $4,000 to the supplier for that, and then maybe $300 to the buyer for the local fees, because there's still going to be some local fees there, right? Well, they're going to charge maybe $2,000 or $3,000 only to the supplier, but all the difference and more, they will charge to the buyer the local fees, and the buyer only sees the local fees at the last moment. They get the bill and they're like, what? What is that? I never saw that. This doesn't make sense. It's crazy, but there's no way to reason with the freight forwarder on that. Sorry, that's it. You want the goods, you pay for that, right? So be careful about this. I would call it a mini scam. It's something that gets done by suppliers that don't mean too bad, okay? But yeah, if they can get to pay a little bit less, they'll pay a little bit less, right? But for the buyer, it does feel like a scam.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's summarize some of the things that we've gone over, Renaud. So if we go from the early stage of the filtering sourcing process right to the final product quality audit, then we're starting with the supplier blacklist findings. That is, if visit the factory, verify the business, have a contract, try and focus on FOB, try and take control over the freight forwarding, have that separate from the supplier. Okay, great. All right. So you've got stage one risk, and that is you've got a supplier that's not a scam. Okay. The next risk, stage two, is, okay, it's not a scam, but does the supplier have the capability to make your product? And so that's where the factory audit comes into being. And our data is saying that if you have a factory audit and the factory audit is greater than 69 out of 100, now I'm just saying, you know, if you've got two great suppliers, then you order 2 factory audits, and then you go with a supplier that has a better factory audit outcome. So, for example, like that, Renaud. So you pass the second stage risk of making sure that the factory has the capability to make the product that you want. And then you get to the final stage risk, where that is the product quality audit, Renaud.
Yes, absolutely. And some other steps in between, right?
Absolutely,
we don't pretend to have a digitize all the data about the whole buying process and then analyze all the relationships that are possible between all the criteria and so on. But these are very important steps that, well, experienced buyers can play around that if they have a lot of experience around it and they make their own calls. Of course, every situation is a bit different, but as a general rule, that's very, very solid advice, I would say. Yeah.
All good.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Neale.